All right, let's go.
Number 8. Hard determinism. You decided nothing. The universe decided for you. Hard determinism is the bluntest position in this entire debate, and it starts from a premise almost nobody disputes at the level of physics. Every event has a cause, and that cause was itself caused by something before it, stretching back in an unbroken chain. Apply that to a human brain, and the implication is brutal. Your decision to watch this video, the thought you are having right now, the next word you are about to think, all of it is the output of prior physical states. Neurons firing because of other neurons firing, shaped by genetics you did not choose, a childhood you did not choose, a culture you did not choose, and a brain chemistry you do not control, even slightly while it's happening. Trace the chain back far enough and it terminates not at you, but at the initial conditions of the universe itself. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza argued this in the 17th century, that humans believe themselves free only because they are aware of their desires, while remaining ignorant of the causes that produced those desires. We feel like the author of our choices the same way a falling rock might feel if it were conscious, like it chose to fall. Modern hard determinisms point to physics for support. Classical mechanics, the equations governing planets, projectiles, and billiard balls, is fully deterministic. Given the exact state of a system at one moment, its entire future is fixed. If the brain is simply a very complicated physical system obeying the same laws, there is no room anywhere in the chain for an uncaused, freely choosing self to insert itself. The hardest pill in hard determinism is what it does to moral responsibility. If nobody could have done otherwise than what the laws of physics already determined, can anyone actually be praised or blamed for anything? Some hard determinists, including the philosopher Galen Strawson, accept this fully. They argue moral responsibility in the deepest sense is an illusion, even while practical systems of reward and punishment may still be useful for managing behavior. Number 7. Metaphysical Libertarianism. Something in you breaks the chain. Confusingly, this is not about politics. In philosophy, libertarianism is the view that free will is real, that it requires determinism to be false, and that something genuinely uncaused or caused by you, the agent, in a way nothing prior fully determines, exists at the moment of choice. Libertarians accept the incompatibilists' core claim. If determinism is true, free will is impossible. They simply deny that determinism is true, at least where human choice is concerned. The classic version of this argument rests on agent causation, the idea that you, as a unified self, are a genuine originating cause of your actions, not merely a relay station passing along causes that began somewhere else. When you deliberate between two options and choose one, the libertarian claims something happens that is not simply the mechanical unfolding of prior states. A new causal chain begins with you. The obvious problem is explaining how this works without simply describing magic. If your choice was not determined by prior causes, in what sense was it your choice rather than a random event happening to occur inside your skull? Critics call this the problem of luck. An undetermined decision looks suspiciously like a coin flip rather than an act of will, because nothing about your character, desires, or reasoning explains why it landed one way instead of the other. Libertarians have spent centuries trying to answer this without success that satisfies critics, but the position persists because it captures something that hard determinism cannot: the felt experience in the moment of genuine deliberation that more than one future is actually open to you. Number 6. Compatibilism. Maybe you were asking the wrong question. Compatibilism is the dominant position among professional philosophers today, according to surveys of the field, and it works by quietly redefining what free will needs to mean in order to count as real. The compatibilist agrees with the hard determinist that the universe, including your brain, is fully governed by cause and effect. Where they disagree is on what follows from that. The hard determinist says this rules out free will. The compatibilist says it depends entirely on what you meant by free will in the first place. If free will means being uncaused by anything, floating free of the entire causal order, then yes, determinism rules it out. But compatibilists argue nobody actually needs that definition to make sense of freedom in daily life. What we actually care about is whether your action flowed from your own desires, reasoning, and values, rather than from external coercion, compulsion, or manipulation. A person who hands over their wallet because someone is pointing a gun at them is not acting freely. A person who hands over money to a charity because they decided, after reflection, that it aligned with their values is acting freely, even if that act of reflection was itself fully caused by prior brain states. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt refined this further with his theory of higher-order desires. You are free on this view when your actions are guided by desires that you yourself, on reflection, want to have. An addict who wishes they did not crave a drug and acts against their own deeper values when they use it is unfree in a meaningful sense, not because determinism is false, but because their action conflicts with what they actually want to want. Critics on both sides find this unsatisfying. Hard determinists accuse compatibilists of changing the subject rather than answering the original question. Libertarians accuse them of settling for a watered-down freedom that explains responsibility but not the deep, felt sense that the future was genuinely open. Compatibilists respond that this felt sense may simply be a misleading intuition, and that a workable theory of freedom does not need to honor every intuition we happen to have.
Number 5. The Neuroscience Challenge. Your brain decided before you knew about it. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran an experiment that became one of the most cited and most contested pieces of evidence in this entire debate. Subjects sat in front of a clock and were asked to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it, with no external prompt, and to note the exact moment they became consciously aware of the urge to move. Libet recorded their brain activity throughout using EEG. He found something striking: a slow buildup of electrical activity in the motor cortex called the readiness potential began roughly 550 milliseconds before the wrist actually moved. But subjects did not report becoming consciously aware of their intention to move until only about 200 milliseconds before the movement. The brain, in other words, appeared to start preparing the action more than a third of a second before the conscious mind reported deciding to do it. To Libet and many who interpreted his work afterward, this looked like direct evidence that the brain makes the decision unconsciously first, and consciousness simply receives the news afterward, producing the illusion of having decided. But the readiness potential interpretation has come under serious attack in recent years. Neuroscientist Aaron Shuger published work arguing the readiness potential may not represent a decision being made at all. It may simply reflect ongoing random fluctuations in neural activity that exist constantly in the brain, and a movement happens to get triggered whenever that natural noise happens to cross a certain threshold with no specific decision point hiding inside it. Under this model, the readiness potential is not the brain deciding in secret. It is closer to background noise that occasionally tips over a threshold, the same way ocean waves occasionally happen to crest higher than others, with no individual wave being decided in advance. A 2023 study published in Neuropsychologica further complicated the picture, finding that the gap between the readiness potential and reported conscious intention could shift depending on how the experiment itself was conducted, suggesting the timing Libet measured may partly be an artifact of the experimental method rather than a fixed feature of how decisions are made. The honest scientific position in 2026 is that the Libet experiment neither proves nor disproves free will. It does show that simple, low-stakes motor decisions involve unconscious preparatory brain activity. Whether that generalizes to complex, deliberated choices, choosing a career, ending a relationship, deciding what you believe, remains entirely unresolved.
Number 4. Quantum indeterminism. Maybe the universe itself is not fully determined. Classical physics is deterministic. Quantum mechanics, famously, is not, at least according to the standard interpretation most physicists use. At the quantum level, certain events appear to be genuinely random rather than merely unpredictable due to incomplete information. The decay of a radioactive atom at any specific instant cannot be predicted, even in principle, only assigned a probability. If this randomness is real rather than an illusion produced by hidden variables we have not yet discovered, then determinism in the strict classical billiard ball sense is simply false at the most fundamental level of reality. Some philosophers have seized on this as a possible opening for free will, reasoning that if the universe is not fully determined, perhaps human choices are not fully determined either. The problem is that this argument, taken at face value, does not actually deliver what libertarians want. Quantum randomness is still randomness, uncaused in the sense of not being predictable, but not caused by you either. If your decision to do one thing rather than another ultimately traces back to a random quantum event in a neuron, that does not make the decision more yours. It just makes it less predictable. A coin flip is not an act of free will merely because it is undetermined. A more serious version of this argument, advanced by figures like physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff in their orchestrated objective reduction theory, proposes that quantum effects occurring in structures called microtubules inside neurons might play a direct causal role in conscious decision-making, potentially linking quantum indeterminacy to consciousness itself in a way that goes beyond simple randomness. This remains a minority position among neuroscientists and physicists, with most considering brain temperature far too warm and noisy to sustain the kind of delicate quantum coherence the theory requires. As of 2026, no experiment has confirmed that quantum effects play any decision-relevant role in human cognition. Quantum mechanics breaks strict physical determinism. It has not yet given anyone a working mechanism for free will.
Number 3. The authorship illusion. The feeling is real. The thing it describes is not. Illusionism takes a step back from the entire determinism versus indeterminism fight and attacks something else, the reliability of your own introspection. The claim is straightforward and, to many people, deeply unsettling. You experience a vivid, undeniable feeling of authorship over your choices. You feel, in the moment, like you are the one deciding. Illusionists argue this feeling is real as a psychological experience, but it does not accurately describe what is actually happening inside your brain. The feeling of choosing is itself a product of brain processes constructing a narrative after the fact, the same way your visual system constructs a seamless picture of the world that papers over its own blind spot. Psychologist Daniel Wegner argued exactly this in his work on what he called the illusion of conscious will, drawing on experiments where people could be made to feel they had caused events they had no actual causal role in, and conversely, situations where people performed actions without any accompanying feeling of having willed them. If the feeling of authorship can be manufactured or removed independently of what is actually causing your behavior, then that feeling cannot be reliable evidence that you possess libertarian free will. It is simply something your brain generates, useful for tracking and predicting your own behavior regardless of what is actually driving it underneath. This is distinct from hard determinism. A hard determinist says free will does not exist because the universe is deterministic. An illusionist says the entire concept may be confused from the start, built on an introspective report that was never trustworthy evidence of anything metaphysical to begin with. Your sense of freely choosing is treated the same way a magician treats a trick, convincing, vivid, and not at all what it appears to be. Number 2. Enactivism and emergent freedom. Freedom is not in the neuron, it is in the system. A newer position, gaining traction particularly among researchers studying complex systems and embodied cognition, argues that the entire debate has been looking at the wrong level of description. Determinists and hard scientists analyzing free will tend to zoom into the smallest physical components, neurons, atoms, quantum states, and ask whether freedom can be located there. It cannot. No single neuron is free. No single atom in your brain is making a choice, but proponents of emergent or systems-level freedom argue this is the wrong place to look, the same way you would never find wetness by examining a single water molecule in isolation. Wetness is a property that exists only at the level of the system, not the component. On this view, an organism, a self-regulating, environment-sensing, goal-directed system like a human being, exhibits a genuine form of autonomy at the level of the whole system, even though every component obeys deterministic or probabilistic physical law.
The system as a whole responds to reasons, models possible futures, weighs them against internalized values built from a lifetime of experience, and selects actions in a way that is not reducible to or fully predictable from the behavior of any individual particle inside it. Not because something non-physical is involved, but because the relevant causal patterns simply do not exist at the particle level at all. This position tries to dissolve the conflict rather than pick a side. It is not libertarian because it accepts the underlying physics is deterministic or probabilistic all the way down. It is not quite traditional compatibilism either, because it places less emphasis on internal psychological states like desires, and more emphasis on the organism as a self-organizing system with genuine system-level causal powers that cannot be meaningfully described at the level of physics alone. Critics argue this risks being a restatement of compatibilism with extra vocabulary rather than a genuinely new answer. Proponents argue it correctly identifies why the entire question feels unanswerable when posed at the level of physics, because freedom, if it exists at all, was never going to be found there.
Number 1. The practical necessity argument. You will act as if you are free either way. This final position does not try to resolve the metaphysics at all. It argues the metaphysics may be permanently unresolvable, and that this does not matter nearly as much as people assume. Philosopher Peter Strawson made an influential version of this argument. Human social life, moral judgment, gratitude, resentment, love, and blame are built into the basic structure of how humans relate to one another, and these reactive attitudes are not contingent on first resolving an abstract metaphysical debate. We will continue holding each other responsible, feeling pride in our accomplishments, and experiencing regret over our mistakes, regardless of which theory of free will turns out to be correct, because these responses are woven into what it means to function as a human being among other humans. There is experimental support for taking this seriously. Studies in psychology, including research led by Kathleen Voss and Jonathan Schooler in the 2000s, found that people induced to read material arguing free will is an illusion were subsequently more likely to cheat on a test when given the opportunity compared to people who had not been exposed to deterministic arguments. Believing you lack control over your actions appears to measurably change how you behave, independent of whether the belief is metaphysically correct. This creates an odd practical loop. Even a committed hard determinist gets up in the morning, deliberates over decisions, feels regret over mistakes, and plans for the future as though choices matter, because there is no coherent alternative way to actually live, regardless of what they believe is true at the level of physics. The philosopher might write papers proving free will does not exist, and then go vote in an election, write a will, apologize to a friend, and set a New Year's resolution that same week. Some philosophers, including pragmatists working in this tradition, argue this practical necessity is itself a kind of answer, not a proof that free will exists, but evidence that the concept is doing indispensable work regardless of its ultimate metaphysical status, the same way you can use a map you know is not a perfectly accurate representation of the territory, because it still gets you where you need to go. 8 theories. Hard determinism, or the chain of cause and effect, stretches back through your decision to the beginning of time and leaves no room for you in it. Libertarianism, insisting something in you genuinely breaks that chain at the cost of explaining how without invoking luck. Compatibilism, quietly redefining freedom into something that survives a deterministic universe. Neuroscience, showing unconscious brain activity precedes conscious awareness of simple decisions while remaining deeply contested about what that actually proves. Quantum mechanics, breaking strict determinism at the smallest scales without delivering anything resembling a mechanism for choice. Illusionism, suggesting the feeling of choosing was never reliable evidence of anything to begin with. Emergent freedom, relocating the entire question to a level where particles cannot answer it. And practical necessity, which simply notes that every one of us will act as though we are free tomorrow morning, no matter which of these theories we believe tonight. None of these are settled.
Neuroscientists disagree. Physicists disagree. Philosophers have disagreed for over 2,000 years and show no sign of stopping. The question of whether you are choosing this thought right now sits exactly where it has always sat, somewhere underneath everything you do, answered differently depending on who you ask, and never once getting in the way of you simply continuing to act. Subscribe to Cosmic Hives. See you in the next one.